Hi everyone, welcome to week 3. Today I'm coming to you from my office. I am a clinical therapist and I work with mostly foster youth and youth in the juvenile Department of Justice. I also work with outpatients who are youth and adults. So with my foster youth, I do a lot of trauma therapy. So today we're going to look again and just review what is trauma, and then we're going to talk about the biology of trauma and how trauma affects brain development in our youth. So just a few things to remember: that the first core project, which is 2 parts, is going to be due on May 30th. I hope by now you all have kind of figured out a good setup as far as your time management with reading and watching videos and reading supplemental things. I really do hope you are taking advantage of all the resources we are providing. It really gives a full picture of what we're trying to learn here. And just a reminder that I don't go over everything in the notes. It's always your responsibility to review these slides thoroughly and do the assignments in the module on Canvas. So remember when we talked about trauma, we said that there were 3 E's. We said that trauma results from an event or a series of events. We said it had to be experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, right? And it had to have lasting adverse effects on their functioning in those different areas. And most importantly, we said that it had to be from the perception of the individual that it was trauma, right? We said it could be life-threatening to them, but you might not think it was life-threatening. That doesn't matter. If they perceive it as life-threatening, then for them, it's a trauma. So some of the things we're going to be talking about in this little like biology, neurology 101 for about how our brain works is we're going to look at a few little parts of the brain and the neuron and the cells in the brain, and we're going to talk about a few things of how they work together. So if we take a look at this diagram right over here, we have what is the neuron, and that is this little thingamajigger right here, right? And neurons are nerve cells that are made up of the body, which is right here, and the axon, which is like this long little whip thingamajigger. And then we have the synapses, and if you take a look at the insert right here, synapses are the space between neurons. So the neurons, you can see the axon right up. Where did my little thingy go? Oh, here we go. Sorry. So we have up here the axon comes off. It's like a little tail, right? And then you have these little guys here that come off. And these guys shoot neurotransmitters, which are, it's the next word, hormones. So you can see in here, they communicate with each other via hormones. So if you look at the key points, you see that hormones are the fuels of the brain, and that the communication and the pathways, how the brain talks to itself in between the neurons, is called neural networks. And we also know that the interaction between a person and their environment really influences the brain's developmental process. So how it develops and processes the neurons. Take a quick moment to talk about VENS. VENS are a special type of neuron. As you can see up here, it's much larger. These dendrites come out a lot longer. It's in the front, the frontal insula, and in the anterior cingulate cortex. So both of these areas we know are correlated with emotions, serotonin, dopamine. Those are hormones that we just talked about as being the fuel, right? And those are the things that get neurotransmitters help toss between the nerves. So we know that when the brain develops, it develops in the sequential order. That means like you have step 1, step 2, step 3, and normally it's the same. And a lot of times it has to do with age, right? So like when a kid is between the age of 0 and 3, they have 80% of their brain development. So we know that if a trauma occurs at this age, it will significantly alter or deter like normative functioning of the brain. We also know that the pathways that are triggered the most, the ones that are used the most, are the ones that grow the most. But it kind of makes sense though, right? If the brain sends messages for our body to function, and one neural pathway is used a lot more, then it needs to be better. It needs to grow faster, and it needs to grow stronger. So we'll talk about this here again in a hot second, but that means that if your fear or alert response is alarmed again and again and again, then that pathway, that little map, is going to be way, way, way darker. It's kind of like, this is, I just dropped my pen. If you have a piece of paper and we draw a line on it, and that's a neural pathway. So that's like the first time somebody experiences a trauma or gets scared. But then each time they experience that, that pathway is going to be used again and again and again and again and again and again. And it's going to get darker and darker. So it's going to become the default pathway that youth is going to use. So because whoa, holy granola bars. What happened there? Okay, because it becomes so dark, it's its default path. It knows that it takes that path provides what it needs. So even when there's just a minor trigger, it goes that path. So a minor trigger can have major responses because of that neurological path from trauma history. So when we talk about brain development, we're going to look at brainstem and midbrain. They both come at birth, and then we have the limbic system, and then we have the cortex. So the limbic system is responsible for emotional regulation and attachment, and the cortex is responsible for learning cognitions like abstract and concrete thoughts. So the limbic system is where we're going to focus, and the limbic system is made up of the amygdala and the hippocampus. So the amygdala, it processes our emotions, and it is where our fight, flight, or freeze lives, right there. It is the part of the brain that secretes the hormone that keeps us safe, right? Fight, flight, or freeze. And the hippocampus processes the information from the amygdala and sends it to our cortex. So here's where we start to see how trauma affects the brain, how it communicates, and how it develops. So the hippocampus, it will shut down if stress levels are too high. And the hormone that is secreted is called cortisol. So let's look at this example that's right here. Let's say you're startled from a noise behind you, right? The amygdala, I'm going to do this, and we'll talk about the hindbrain here in a second, but this is just like a habit for me. The amygdala, right? It receives information from our ears and from our eyes, and then it releases a stress hormone, cortisol, which is going to put us into flight, fight, or freeze, because that's what keeps us safe. So you turn around and you see that it was a book that fell from the shelf. It's not somebody coming to hurt you, right? So the hippocampus, which is like right here on our hindbrain, the hippocampus then processes all the information from the amygdala. So what the hippocampus is saying, I heard a scary thing, I need to fight, flight, or freeze. But the cortex, this part right here, it's going to process the information also. Like, I see with my eyes, that was a book that fell. I'm safe. So this stops the amygdala from firing and decreases the cortisol, and it returns us to a baseline hormone level and baseline ability to control to control our amygdala. So if you're traumatized and your baseline cortisol levels are too high, that usually means that maltreatment, so abuse, like physical abuse, you are startled easily. But if someone has been neglected, then those baseline cortisol levels are going to be too low. So when we see someone who has a higher cortisol level, then we're going to see that they have slower cognitive processing, right? Because that prefrontal cortex isn't able to engage. They're going to have suppressed immune systems, and they're going to have emotional and affective disorders like PTSD and personality disorders and mood disorders. Now, if someone has a lower amount of cortisol levels, we're going to see fatigue, suppressed immune systems, decreased learning ability, and externalizing disorders such as ADD and ODD and CD and things of that nature. So what we see here is too much or too little is going to result in developmental issues with brain development, and then how those are expressed. I will let you guys read these things on your own. So the biological impact. When we look at the underdeveloped brain components, we know that the left hemisphere is language, and when it's underdeveloped, often it it's often more underdeveloped and the right is more active than normative functioning. So when we have underdeveloped cerebellums, that's motor and executive functioning. So executive functioning is ADHD, can be a result of underdeveloped executive functioning. When we have the underdeveloped prefrontal cortex, that's where we have learning, behavior, cognitive, and emotional regulation disorders identified. And then we can read the rest of that on. So I'm going to let you read this. This talks about the communication system between the brain and the body. It talks about regulating and how, again, if it's always being activated, there's going to be chronic dysfunction, and then the child's going to exhibit coping behaviors that are adaptive to that environment, but they're going to be maladaptive to be safe. We'll talk about that in a minute. All right, the handbrain. This is my favorite thing. And I cannot tell you how useful this is for parents to understand. So you have a video, so I'm not going to go over it a whole lot, but it's called Flipping Your Lid. You've got your amygdala, you've got your hippocampus, and you've got your prefrontal cortex, right? They all have to work together. But this, the alarm system, that's what's fired up with trauma responses and trauma reminders. How I explain it to my kids is that we've got our amygdala, which is our watchdog or our guard dog. Our prefrontal cortex is our wise owl, and our hippocampus is our elephant. So when we've experienced traumas over and over again, and our amygdala is fired and it's shooting off the cortisol, our guard dog is like going crazy, and I bark. I'll be like, our guard dog is like, and all that barking, it scares away our wise owl. Woo! He flies away because he's afraid. And our elephant, well, she runs away too. She thuds away because she's afraid. And then our guard dog doesn't have anyone to help him calm down. So we have to use skills that can help our guard dog realize that they're safe, stop barking so that our wise owl, our prefrontal cortex, can come back into play, and use logic to tell our amygdala that we're safe. And our hippocampus can also process what's been happening. There's so much, like I wish I could share so much with you about the biology of the brain and the way that trauma affects the brain. It's really what I love. And I cannot tell you how big of a difference it makes for a foster youth or any youth who's experienced trauma and their caregivers to start to understand that their trauma responses, their behaviors are not what they choose to do. That there's a neurological explanation that we can say we measured. There is an increase in cortisol that is affecting this, right? This is what is happening. And so we can answer that question of why. Why is that happening? And we can explain it through the handbrain and through other avenues of psychoeducation. But I have seen it be such a tremendous tool for people to understand their own behaviors, and then for caregivers to understand their behaviors, and then learn how to help the amygdala calm down, help the prefrontal cortex know that it's safe, and help the hippocampus be able to engage again. We're going to take a real quick look here at Mod 3. Please, please, please watch all these videos. Read Chapter 3 of our book. I love this book. I'm reading it again with you guys right now. I don't think I'll ever get bored of reading this book again and again and again. And make sure to check out pages 1 through 7 of this attachment here. There's also the handbrain video over here. It is fantastic. And again, I cannot reiterate how many times I have used this to help my clients and caregivers. So I will be inserting this video here. You can just click here to watch it. Please complete week 3's activities by Sunday at 11:59. And there is also a 10-question quiz. Should be totally okay with it. Also, please remember that on Sunday the 30th, you do have your trauma research project, and it is 2 parts. If you all have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. Again, I wish I could talk to you forever about trauma in the brain, but I just can't. So I guess you're lucky we're not in a classroom, because I would totally lecture a ton about it. But please explore it, educate yourself, and ask any questions that you have. Have a fantastic week and good luck, y'all.